the Spanish flu came along and killed more people per year than the war did. And so you're always talking about what would we do, how bad would it be? And it's scary because the amount of travel now is so great that the speed, that one it was unlucky because the demobilization helped spread the disease. But now we have way more international travel than ever in the past. That without practice, you're never going to be able to figure out what to do when time is of the essence. And infections are exponential. You know, if you catch it in the first 100 days, it's less than 2% of the deaths. If you let it linger for 2 years, you know, here we are globally a bit over 20 million, it looks like. You know, Australia almost got it right. You know, they're down at 10% of the deaths, you know, per capita of the United States. And they had practiced a little bit with the previous, the SARS-CoV-1 had made them think, gosh, our public labs can't do diagnostics. We have to team up with these commercial PCR machine people. And that's how we'll be able to find the cases and isolate them and avoid that big slope.
Right.
And
because once you get on that slope also, it's important that the only way to deal with it is then lockdowns, which are also economically very expensive, right? So it's really, there's a huge advantage to being able to get it before that exponential slope goes up.
Yeah, there's only one country that got past 1% infection and then got it to zero, which is South Korea. Used an extreme form of contact tracing where without even asking your permission, they would look using the cell tower data and see where you'd been. And they were pretty ruthless about how they enforced their contact tracing. Everyone else that's a super outlier pretty much reacted quickly. Taiwan, New Zealand, Singapore, and you know, and then they got their vaccination levels up so that eventually they didn't have to be extreme about blocking people coming into the country. We did not expect anything like this Omicron variant that is so transmissive. In fact, scientists are still trying to figure out where the heck did it come from, because it's only related all the way back to the original virus. And so there's reasons to think it may have been in another species and crossed back over, but that seems strange. You know, if there was a group of humans that was growing in, why didn't we see it sooner? Anyway, the science in this area will get a lot of attention, I hope, in the next decade. There could be more variants come that would be immune escaping because their shape of their spike protein would be a little different. And sadly, they could even have a higher fatality rate. You know, I rate the chance of that as, you know, maybe 5 to 10%. But, you know, if you tell people that risk isn't there, then the whole idea of, okay, you know, throw your masks away, don't get your boosters, you're going to put people incredibly at risk. For now, we need to keep boosting, particularly the elderly. And even though we'll have a lot of cases we don't have to use masks, you know, the public should be ready and not view it as a deep infringement of, you know, their freedom, that when you get local outbreaks, which, you know, in the fall we'll have some of that, it helps a lot to have very high vaccination levels and, in certain settings, mask wearing.
You and I have talked about, you know, Taiwan, which is this extraordinary case. I mean, 22 million people. I don't remember the latest death numbers, but it's sort of under 1,000. And just by comparison, New York State is 19 million. I think we're up to 40,000 deaths or something like that. So it gives you a feel for how well Taiwan did. And they did it because they didn't do lockdowns. They instead said, if you have COVID or if you've been in contact with somebody, you have to quarantine. It was a 14-day mandatory quarantine where they give you a government-issued cell phone and they checked on you 3 or 4 times a day to make sure that you were adhering to it. But by doing that, they kept 1% of their population in quarantine at, you know, if you add up all the numbers of people. But 99% were able to live their lives with no lockdowns, no restrictions of any meaningful kind other than mask wearing.
There was a lot of uncertainty about, for example, school shutdowns. To this day, you know, there's still arguments about how many cases that avoided. It's pretty clear, because young people don't get sick from the disease very often, that we probably, if we knew everything we know today, we would have shut schools down a lot less than we did during this pandemic.
But back to this, should we be willing to accept some restrictions on our liberties?
Absolutely. But, you know, the U.S., that's not our greatest strength. That is making, in some cases, sacrifice for the collective. We're a society of individual rights, and there's a lot to be said for that. It wasn't until early February, when I was in a meeting, that experts at the foundation said, there's no way, you know, there's been too much travel without diagnosis for us to contain this. And then at that point, we didn't really understand the fatality rate. You know, we didn't understand that it's a fairly low fatality rate, and that it's a disease mainly of the elderly, kind of like flu is, although a bit different than that. So that was a pretty scary period,
right,
where the world didn't go on alert, including the United States, nearly as fast as it needed to. Yeah, smallpox, which is the only disease we've ever eradicated, had about a 30% death rate.
Wow.
And so, you know, that's a factor of 100 worse. You know, bubonic plague had a death rate of about 40%. So awful pathogens can show up. Even in the case of flu, there have been some variants that are even more fatal than the Spanish flu was. The good news is that we've never seen since 1918 something that combined an ability to transmit very effectively and this very high fatality.
So the one big difference between this pandemic and every previous one was the arrival of the vaccines. And the vaccines on an amazingly accelerated timescale. I mean, the last vaccine, I think you have this in the book, it took about 4 or 5 years. This one really took 4 or 5 months, if you think about by the time they had got it right, and then they were doing testing to make sure it was okay. Do you think that particularly because of this new mRNA technology, that's one thing we can be confident of, that going forward, you know, no matter what the virus, we will be able to, within 9 months, have a vaccine?
Probably. You know, the HIV has a way of evading the immune system that we've never seen in any respiratory virus. So saying that that can't be done, but it's very unlikely. Every respiratory virus has some protein that latches onto cells in the lungs, and that enters. So ACE2, in the case of COVID, is the way it gets in. And what we can do is we can make a vaccine that alerts the immune system, okay, that shape, attack that shape when you see that. And mRNA, you know, we could even speed it up a bit faster. There had never been a commercial product using mRNA. And so it's wild that it was so fast. Even the non-mRNA vaccines worked very well. Probably the two best are the Pfizer and Moderna that are both mRNA, but even the AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, there's a lot of good vaccines. The vaccines are imperfect in two very important ways. One is they don't block infection. We were hoping that the vaccine would create enough antibodies in your upper respiratory tract, including your nose and throat, that vaccinated people wouldn't get infected. And part of the impetus to say, okay, even young people who don't get very sick should get vaccinated is if you can take them out of the transmission chains, that drops the numbers very rapidly. Well, once Omicron comes along, the vaccine is not reducing transmission hardly at all, particularly about 3 or 4 months after you take the vaccine. So we need to fix that, and there's good ideas about how to do that. The other thing is duration. You know, we're seeing through a variety of the data, Israel data, UK data, that particularly if you're in your 70s, within 4 or 5 months of taking the vaccine, the protection really is going down. Weirdly, for young people, that protection does not seem to go down. And we've seen this with previous vaccines. Like the flu vaccine actually doesn't work that well in the elderly. We're going to create some new flu vaccines that are much better. And so